I'd say you did a lot of the heavy lifting. And I want to ask you, is this moment of clear, obvious disagreement between the US and the Europeans on this specific issue, which raises perhaps other dimensions than earlier disagreements on climate or even on trade, do you see this as a tipping point?
I'm always nervous about tipping points because it's amazing what you will do before you tip, in a sense, and I'm not sure where the tip would take us. I think the kind of the deep question, because we've talked a little bit about this issue in the last session, the deep question for me is, I'm a passionate believer in diplomacy. Even the worst of times and the worst of conflicts end up with needing diplomacy to come to solutions for the future. And diplomacy relies on people being able to take decisions and stick to them. And so we rely on the continuity of diplomatic action across different governments coming and going, even those who don't like them. And we find ourselves in a situation where the most important deal of its time, with the most extraordinary collection of nations that have ever worked together, despite simultaneously having huge areas of contention, not least Ukraine, managed to keep going through all of it and to find a conclusion that all agreed to and that was working. And so it's very complicated to me to think about how we're going to move forward if we can't do that anymore, and how we're going to do diplomatic action again that's going to need more than just one country talking to another. And I think for Europeans this is a deeply, deeply troubling moment.
Damon, bond or bust up?
We are sure testing this bond right now. But let me just offer a little bit of context. And I do this more from an analytical perspective, not as an advocate or a critic. But what we're seeing right now in this debate in the transatlantic space is really the outgrowth of a pretty climactic domestic debate that we've had in the United States, in which, for the first time in our history, a populist won the White House. And there's a reason for that. Coming out of the Great Recession, a sense that leaders in the two parties hadn't managed to take care of Main Street. This sense among our population of the long wars that never end. And this sense that there's perpetual gridlock in Washington. It produced what we have now for the first time, a populist that won the White House. And what that means is that he's brought with him far less received wisdom, if you will, received conventional wisdom of some core principles and values, that I'm a passionate believer in the transatlantic relationship. A set of eyes that look at things and have been asking themselves, we don't really understand why Americans care more about Europe's defense, Europe's energy security, the challenges coming from the east and the south of the continent than Europeans. And we're seeing a lot of this manifest in very difficult, contentious debates. Now, I think this is damaging. I think it's a problem, a fundamental problem when the US and Europe are not aligned. It opens oxygen for bad guys to play games. But it's not like we haven't been here before. Whether Suez Canal, Vietnam, deployment of nuclear forces, we've been through extraordinary crises in the transatlantic relationship. I myself served both at NATO and at the White House during the Iraq War, which was a real crisis. Right now we're still in a brewing mode, rhetorical crises, beginning to talk about. We actually haven't hit the real crisis. I think this year is going to get even harder as the real crises actually begin to play out. And sometimes it's a painful lesson to learn that when the United States and Europe are not together, everything that we want to do, anything that Washington wants to do becomes more difficult. We'll see if we get to that conclusion at some point. We're not there by any means yet.
I want to ask all of you, what kind of, we've spoken about the current situation, like we've spoken about the diagnosis of the taking the temperature of the situation, but what are the the key consequence that you anticipate of this situation? You've all said, yes, this is damaging and this has many signs of a breakup. What would you say is the key consequence for Europe, perhaps for Europe's unity? And then on other issues, which Damon alluded to, perhaps dealing with Russia. I don't want to get into the specifics of the Middle Eastern situation, which you discussed earlier today, but staying on that element of how it affects Europe, what would you say might be the key consequence that everybody has to keep an eye on right now? Catherine.
Well, I think you mentioned Russia, and I would put how Russia sees the situation pretty high on my list of their desire to ensure their own role, not just in relationship to European nations, but more generally in the world. Their opportunities that if the US is disengaging, as they might see it, to be stronger in their voice and actions in pursuit of their own objectives. And for European nations, those voices who echo, in a sense, the nature of the United States administration become stronger too, because the voices that say, no, we stand together, we are stronger together, we are an incredibly important economic and political bloc, those voices may be drowned out by others who say, actually, it's every state for itself.
Who might say that? Catherine, who might say that first and foremost in Europe, do you think?
Well, I think it could be leaders who perhaps are running on the basis that they don't like elements of what Europe is doing, particularly what is become known as Brussels, which is no longer a place, it's almost a state of mind, I think. So you could hear that in countries like Hungary or Poland, where there is a more populist sense. I'm not saying they'd want to leave the European Union, and I'm not saying that they would be anti-Europe in that sense, but this idea that you have rules and regulations that are made elsewhere is become quite potent. I see that in Britain too. The concern of taking back control, which was a big slogan in the whole debate on Brexit, but which becomes an easy slogan for people to rally round if they feel hard done by, if they feel that their lives have not improved, if they see the problems as coming from being part of this bigger operation that tells them what to do. So it becomes a kind of an echo that resonates across many countries if we're not careful.
Carl, do you worry that Poland, Hungary, perhaps others might break ranks with France, Germany, Britain in this moment of transatlantic tensions?
Not on this, but there are tension on other issues, needless to say. But let me say on the sort of the effects of it, clearly the one who is a beneficiary is Mr. Putin, no question about that. First, he now has oil prices at $80. And I saw in the Russian media that they're now revising the Russian budget because they have an abundance of money to spend. And it's not going to be to support human rights defenders, to put it mildly. It's going to be on other subjects primarily. Secondly, he noticed that when the European Union leaders meet, they have no time to discuss the problem of Russia. They are forced to discuss the problem of Trump all the time. And that is what happened the other day. It was Trump, Trump, Trump. Trump trade, Trump Iran, Trump whatever, which is the main subject of the European Union. That is most unfortunate, but unavoidable. And I'm fierce believer in the transatlantic bonds. But I have to say that what happened, Cathy can speak to the Iran dimensions of the JCPOA. I am profoundly upset with the transatlantic aspect of it, because essentially, I mean, Mr. Trump is free to have whatever sanctions he wants on American business. Feel free. But that is irrelevant in this particular context. What he's doing is have sanctions on European business. which is because he can't do anything about the Russians and the Iranians, and the Chinese and the Indians or whatever. It's the Europeans he's after, which is another way of saying that he denies Europe the sovereign right to have its own foreign policy. He treats us as a doormat. And is that acceptable to Europeans? Don't we have the right to sovereignty in foreign affairs? He denies us that. And then he forces us to do things that I think are detrimental to bonds that should be far more important than this particular battle. But that's where we are. It's most unfortunate that we are where we are. And it was certainly the Europeans' fault. But the Europeans can't be treated like a doormat. That's it.
Damon, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. I just wanted to say to the audience, we're going to come to you for questions in a short moment on the aspect of how serious is this crisis, this transatlantic crisis. Later on, I think we'll discuss what Europeans can do about it. But if you're curious if there's an aspect that we haven't spoken about the dimensions of this crisis, then please come in with a question. Damon, what's your assessment of the main consequence?
Well, I think it's important also. It's so hard to, you can't look past President Trump. He won't allow you to look past him with some of his positions, his rhetoric, his language. But I do think you miss a little bit of the story if you're blinded by the Twitter account. And if you think about what the United States is doing and watch that, we've got some real consequences on Iran I'll come back to. But on the European side, they're sitting in Washington thinking, we've just put $11 billion into the European Deterrence Initiative. We have American forces in the East for the first time in a long time, and we're may come under this administration to permanent positioning, or effectively so, in the East. That it's an administration that has given defensive weapons to Ukraine and Georgia to try to prevent the rollback that we see coming out of the Kremlin, that has tried to stand behind this investment in Central and Eastern Europe, the 3 Cs, not as a way to divide Europe, but as a way to block Russian influence in Chinese capital or to respond to it. And that's been really aggressive on energy security, trying to remove LNG export barriers to exports, and also challenge what's happening on pipeline politics here. In some respects, from their perspective, an extremely pro-Europe policy on the European continent. The challenge is that the issues that are often most important in the capitals here, Paris, trade, Iran, are where the breaches are. And the problem with us on the United States side is I don't think the administration has a full appreciation. The value of the United States being at the center of a rules-based order is incredible for the reserve currency of the dollar, a SWIFT network in which financial transactions rely on things that happen in the United States. China, Russia, Iran would welcome the opportunity to create real alternatives. The last thing we want to do is incentivize our adversaries, much less our allies, to create alternatives that begin to weaken the U.S. influence on this global system. And that's potentially a longer-term consequence that I don't think is fully appreciated in Washington today.
Okay, are there questions here? And here I'll take 2 questions to start with, please. And then if a microphone can go that way.
Edward Lucas from SEPA. I think that the economic dimension is quite interesting here. Europe is bigger and richer than the United States by quite a large amount, population and GDP terms. Why is the economic centre of gravity and the political centre of gravity so different?
Okay, and another question here.
My issue with the Trump administration, it's not disengagement from Europe, it's the discrediting of the transatlantic consensus, it's the discrediting of a liberal world order. And Damon, you talked about giving, opening up the space for sort of alternative visions of the world. It's precisely Trump's, I would say, delinquent behavior that's creating the opportunity and creating the demand for alternative systems of global governance. And just a quick point on, You mentioned, Natalie, right at the start about separating the psychological personality study from the policy. I'm not sure that we can do that readily. And maybe, paradoxically, that might be a source of consolation. Because if we take the view that, in a sense, we've got something of a nutter in the White House, and that this is an extraordinary aberration, but maybe only a temporary aberration, then maybe we can look longer term to the ties that bind, that will transcend and extend far long after Trump has gone. And maybe that's the element of consolation that we can hold on to.
Okay, so two very good questions. Europe's economic clout and Bobo Lowe's very good question. Who would like to go for it? Catherine.
So one of the positives you can read from not having business as usual across the Atlantic is it's potentially an opportunity for Europe to strengthen and develop its collaboration with itself. Leave aside the British position for the moment, but the countries that are in the EU and that orbit it have an incentive in a way to try and tackle some of the issues themselves, to take on some more of the responsibilities when America says, actually, when you look at defence, we think you should do more. To look at its centre of gravity in terms of economic issues, and if you like, to feel its own strength. Some of the things that I tried to do as High Representative, not least the Serbia-Kosovo agreement, was partly about Europe taking responsibility in its own backyard for issues that it ought to be leading on, maybe with American support, maybe not, but that really did matter to Europe to resolve and to show we could do it. You can argue how successful some were and some weren't in the issues that Europe dealt with. But it does provide, I suppose, an incentive, if Europe wishes to actually try and deal with the fact that it's a huge economy, that it can play a much stronger role, and that it has got clout when it collaborates effectively.
Carl.
And I wouldn't disagree with that, surprise, surprise. But another aspect of it just, that is that we are dealing with these particular issues, absolutely, in themselves. But then we are also dealing with the fact, and here we have sort of a fairly significant philosophical difference with the Trump administration. And that is that they fundamentally don't believe in what is sometimes somewhat superficially regarded as the liberal global order. It is doubtful they believe in any global order whatsoever. If you read the National Security Strategy, which is a fairly sophisticated document, it's not written by the president, it's not written by John Bolton because he wasn't there at the time. It's written by fairly sophisticated people. But the philosophy there is the concept of global order doesn't exist. It was in all previous US national security documents. This is the first time where it doesn't exist. Instead, the concept was sovereign states, and sovereign states fighting each other, fight after fight, and America first and America's strength. Well, that to European eyes or ears, sovereign states competing with each other without some sort of overarching order is, for Europeans with the history we have, is something that sooner or later leads to war. I'm not saying that this is going to lead to war immediately. I don't want to be that alarmistic, but that philosophical approach is fundamentally different, both from what we've seen in Europe and necessary, and what we believe is necessary globally. Not that the global order that we have is particularly perfect, not that it's working, not that we don't need to fix it, but to sort of abandon the entire concept. That leads in itself then to Trump saying, well, the Paris Agreement doesn't serve people in Pittsburgh, so who cares? And say, well, there was something wrong, it was signed by Obama, who cares? Or I have some trade relations with people buying too few Chryslers in Berlin and throw out the trade relationship without any consideration for either the transatlantic and the global order. Respect for global order by necessity means that you have to take the interests of others into account. There has to be an element of compromise. There has to be an element of consideration of allies and friends. And that, I fear, is now sort of lacking, and that forces the Europeans to start to discuss actions which unfortunately are necessary, but which are also going to be detrimental long term to that global order that also the United States is dependent upon. And the Putins and the Xi Jinpings of the world are going to benefit, and we're going to lose.
There's no doubt coming out of Washington right now, there's more of a feel of interests, less talk of the values, less received wisdom, less multilateralism, more transactionalism. But in some respects, there's a sense that they would argue that what they're thinking through and trying to do, ironically, is not, as you argue, destruction of a liberal international order. They argue that this is what they're trying to do, preservation of the West. And this harkens back to what is happening within our societies, the fraying of Western democracies, in which we're feeling this in all of our electorates, that is as much a cultural disconnect, an identity issue. Have the elites gone too far? In Washington, you see this debate playing out in Europe vis-a-vis Brussels. And in some respects, there's a sense in their mind of regrounding back away from being everything driven by the Davos Club to how do you re-anchor this back in a sense of where a people that feel left behind are. It's why as they think about Europe, they think about more support for Europe does not mean knee-jerk support for the Commission. It means actually following what Europeans themselves have done, but retain more decision-making power in capitals. So you see that manifesting itself. And you see their mentality of how do you actually preserve this sense of what the West was and is. Again, I'm not trying to justify, I'm not trying to defend, but I do think it's important to understand that perspective, that they're concerned that the debate in Brussels is also disconnected from the political tumultuousness that is rolling across Europe as well. And I think we see a reflection of that. In some respects, the consequences of, as Baroness Ashton mentioned, the potential for Europe that actually is more decisive, I think would be resoundingly welcomed and probably an inadvertent consequence of some of the policies right now. Because it does come back to, again, you have to drop the playbook. The president enters the White House without this base. His first session with Chancellor Merkel, you got Ukraine. You take care of it. It took her explaining to the president that actually it doesn't work that way. The Americans actually have to be in the game, which has given us Kurt Volker, who will be with us today. Because the sense was, okay, if it's in Europe, you got the ball. It's coming with some of those prejudices.
I want to pick up on what something Bobo Lo said, which is this a temporary? Should we think of this as a temporary aberration? You know, not looking at Trump's psychology, but the administration we're dealing with. Would you say that Europeans should look at it? You've well explained. You've given us some insight into how they're thinking, preserving the West. Question is, how do you define that, indeed? But should Europeans look at this moment of transatlantic relations as a temporary aberration? Damon.
Yine. yes and no. Yes and no. In many respects, I think what we see playing out right now existed long before Trump. And we had begun to feel this already, even the Obama administration, the pivot to Europe, a sense of, we didn't really even have a Europe strategy per se for a very long time. And this sense of, you know, a re-anchoring of where American perspective, attention, influence is something that I think is inevitable and continuing to evolve. Mm-hmm. The way we're seeing it play out is pretty unique to the person who occupies the White House today. But some of the underlying trends, fraying of Western democracies, the rise of authoritarian kleptocracies, the fraying, the breakdown of the rules-based international system. These are things that, structural, systematic things that are taking place right now. And with President Trump or not, we are at a point for us as Americans that we're at this, you know, really a hinge point where our relationship, our role in the world is in play. And I think that would be unfolding, Trump or not.
Before I hand you the microphone, I'm going to read one question from somebody in the audience. Should Europeans play hardball and step up business with Iran? At what cost and what risk? But we'll add your question to that.
Well, that was my question. I admit it. I am Paul Taylor, and I did ask that question.
They're anonymous on my screen.
I want you to think through with me the next few months, because you all said it's going to get worse before it gets better. Let's see how it can get worse. Should the Europeans, and will the Europeans say to the Iranians, right, we're going to trade in euros, we'll buy your oil in euros, we'll provide government trade finance in euros for the continuing. Should the EU, will the EU do that? And what does that do to the transatlantic relationship? Would President Trump see that as, oh, wait a second, these guys are playing hardball with us? Maybe we need to we need to take this into account, or will that lead to a rapid further deterioration of the transatlantic relationship, and with what costs and consequences? That's about 6 questions, but it's all about what's going to happen in the next few months, and specifically on Iran, as you call it over there.
Thanks. Before we get into how the Trump administration would react, can the Europeans do it? Can the Europeans do that? Who would like to?
I'd like people to tell us who they are and where they're from, actually, because it's just interesting for the panel.
Paul Taylor, could you?
Yeah. So I wear 2 hats. I'm a journalist with Politico and a senior fellow at Friends of Europe, writing about European defence. Thank you.
It's just interesting for us to know the different backgrounds, so thank you for that. So there are 2 aspects to what the Europeans will be thinking about now. One is that they will want to consider the preservation of an agreement that has all the unique qualities we've talked about a few times already, and which they have committed to as a group of nations, and therefore will want to honour their own commitments. That's important to them. And they will be, on the other hand, looking at the practicalities of how they could do that and the implications of it, because from the Iranian perspective, doing things to fulfill their obligations meant unraveling things, closing things, sealing things, doing things. From the perspective of the Europeans and Americans particularly, it was about economic opportunity being given, with an ambition that would help the country to develop, and with that development might come the opportunity very as quickly as possible to deal with other issues, or to see a country that was more open. And so the other half of the question, apart from fulfilling their obligations, is how do you do that when you have global markets, when you have implications for business, and business will make its decisions for business reasons. So how far governments can intervene or direct business or make changes or try and influence will be something that they're trying to think about. And the truth is, I don't know how far that will be possible, how far it's practical, how far resources could be made available to do that, how far nations will want to prioritize that above the myriad of other things that they're worrying about in their own economies.
Carl, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, trading more with Iran, I think that's going to be significantly, that's going to be sort of difficulties associated with that. Part of that has nothing to do with this particular dispute. The fact that trade is not, or economic links have not developing as fast with Iran after the ACPO as the Iranians expected is partly you can blame the Americans, who haven't really respected the spirit of the agreement, but also because there are problems in Iran. I mean, the transparency of their financial system, to take one example, leaves quite a lot to be desired. To take what I consider probably the #1 impediment. So trading more will be difficult even under the best of circumstances. I think it's more a question of preserving our right to do it and our right to pursue our foreign policy. Then what the economic conditions are going to be, that's a separate issue. And here there are a number of things. I just read news reports that the Americans want to take Iran out of the SWIFT system. That would be a very major thing. I think Europe can prevent that from happening. I think Europe absolutely should prevent that from happening. I think with the Americans starting to endanger the core functions of the global financial system is profoundly dangerous also. So I think we have all sorts of interest. I just saw a news report that the Commission is proposing that in terms of oil payments, that European countries should make direct payments to the Iranian Central Bank in order to avoid any sort of dealings with the American financial system. If the Commission proposes that, I assume it's possible to do that. To which extent it will be done, I don't know. But I said I think it's very important to send the signal that we want to protect our right to pursue our independent foreign policy. Then ideally, on situations like this, we would like to pursue a policy in cooperation with the United States, which we've done over the years, not without its difficulty sometimes, but normally it has worked. But in this particular case, it's different. So a couple of these measures, don't expect them to produce enormous results, because I do expect that particularly the team that we have in the White House at the moment, they will implement that policy with a certain amount of brutality. So we should be expecting a certain amount of brutality to come out of there, and act accordingly. And if we don't act accordingly, we can probably expect more brutality.
Damon, from what you're picking up in Washington among your contacts, do you think it might be possible that the Trump administration would indeed ban Iran, unplug Iran from the SWIFT financial transaction platform, which would basically completely, pull out all oxygen from any kind of transaction that Iran would want to do? And if the Europeans do play hardball, would you see that as just like the end of everything on a transatlantic level, that the Trump administration would like completely cut off any cooperation whatsoever?
The SWIFT movement is a pretty draconian step indeed, debated even in the Obama administration vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, but recognizing that if you tinker with that too much, it does incentivize the creation of alternatives, which over time weakens the American hand and centrality of financial system globally. I guess a couple of things here, because in some respects, on the one hand, you have we've watched, you have a national security advisor now who is known for Pickett's charge to be single-minded and to really drive forward on things and stick to what he would see as a principled position. If you remember the International Criminal Court and the Article 98 negotiations that John Bolton took years driving forward single-mindedly. So there is that capacity in this team to push.
Yeah. He also wanted to knock off a few floors from the UN building in New York.
Yeah, and he didn't.
I remember.
He didn't when he had that seat and owned that responsibility. Part of what we're dealing with on Iran, I think we're in a dangerous mix here, because the ideal outcome from an American perspective, this is sort of the byproduct of the partisan debate on Iran in the United States. It had trouble in the U.S. Senate because it was seen as just isolated nuclear program. And what the critics argued was there wasn't this articulation of the comprehensive strategy of how do you actually, nuclear deal maybe, paired with checking Iranian nefarious influence, the missile program, bolstering Israeli security, support for the Gulf allies, a contextual way to bring together a strategy that you would nest an Iran deal in. It didn't happen in a way that could sustain it. So it became automatically very partisan in the United States, and now we see the manifestation of that internationally. So from an ideal American standpoint, that's what we want with the Europeans. How do we actually have a common strategy to check nefarious Iranian influence more comprehensively? And I think we've now made, on the one hand, Washington was attuned that the Europeans were in town talking, save the nuclear deal, protect European business, rather than helping to have the conversation about how do we manage Iran's negative influence. But if the Europeans respond in kind with some of these sharper measures, there is already a profound misunderstanding of the EU in the White House. And I do worry that this perception that the European Union is functioning as a counter to U.S. influence rather than fundamentally a byproduct of U.S. strategy, that we could fall into a very negative cycle there. I think that's what we need to try to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to take, if we can show some of the questions that are on my little screen here. I'm just going to take the second one. If the Trump administration is developing a strategy for Europe, what should include? And I think, Damon, you mentioned their notion of preserving the West. I mean, does this make sense to you, Catherine, Carl? A strategy towards Europe?
Maybe I'll just say,
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately we don't have Assistant Secretary Mitchell with us, where I think he would have spoken to this more directly. But I think it's actually been an unenviable task, because there has been a pretty good effort in Washington to try to coherently, for the first time in a while, develop an actual Europe strategy. How do you bolster the core of Europe, rebalancing between Brussels and capitals? How do you protect the eastern flank and stabilize the Mediterranean basin? And you can unpack that. There are real things behind that, real decisions, real money, real action, and it's actually pretty good. It's a pretty constructive way to engage on some of the core issues that are unfolding here. But the reality is, how do you have that Europe strategy when the issues of most importance on the European agenda, Iran, trade, climate, are the ones that are cleavage issues, huge cleavage issues? And so I think there's this difficult, awkward dichotomy of trying to lay out a fairly good set of policies about Europe itself, European security, energy security, but overlaid with extraordinary divisiveness on the big tier A issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, I mean, we've been X numbers of European leaders going to the White House and discussing with the president. So if you take the accumulation of the wisdom that has been acquired on what the president wants, it boils down to trade deficit with Germany and with cars.
It does. Yes, it does.
Yeah, that's where we are. I mean, we haven't detected much of an interest in wider strategic issues beyond that, to be quite frank. Okay, Europeans are ready to go back in trade negotiations. Europeans did not break off the trade negotiations. They weren't broken off. They didn't happen. They sort of disappeared. Europeans are prepared to go back to discuss the trade issues that they want to discuss, fine. And they must then discuss the issues that we want to discuss. That's the way it is in negotiations. The thing at the moment is that for that to happen, the European Union wants them to stop imposing steel and aluminum, which are contrary to everything, pretending that we are a national security threat, because that is the 323, I think. They pretend that we are a national security threat and impose sanctions to us, or tariffs. We want them to lift that and then go into talks. They say we refuse to lift those, and we can only go into talks if you in advance promise that the following is going to be the result of the talks. Let's hope, under the best of circumstances, that these are just preliminaries to something that could be somewhat more constructive. But I think the precondition is that they take away the threat of imposing the tariffs and treating us as a national security threat. If we then can sit down on the table and discuss everything from German cars to God knows what, fine.
I agree with that. I think the problem from the European perspective is this particular team have a lack of interest or curiosity, or a sense that we're in this together, and that those who are trying to engage in Washington, because it's crawling with ambassadors who are trying to talk to people, is you've had a lack of people in the State Department to speak to, and also a sense that it's about us doing what America wants, not an engagement between partners on the world stage. And so until that gets corrected in some way, or until there's a greater sense that our priorities count, then it feels more and more that we need to protect ourselves as Europeans from whatever's coming down the track in America's desire to turn slogans about America's relationships to itself and everyone else into action points.
Are there any more questions from the room? I had a question about, yes, there's a gentleman over there, please. Yep. Any more? Okay.
Peter Havlik from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. First, a small information. The day before yesterday, Russia and Iran and Euro-Asian Economic Union signed a free trade agreement. So it seems that there is a new coalition emerging between, let's say, European Union, Russia and China, the other signatures of this deal. What would you comment on this? Thank you.
Well, I have to say that I don't take the Eurasian Economic Union very seriously, because they've not been able to implement a common trade policy. There are very serious difficulties, differences between Belarus, Kazakhstan and Russia. So where there's a functioning entity in terms of making trade deals, I think is debatable. So I think we should see it more as an expression of a political intent. But from that point of view, clearly, yeah, this is going to happen. You will see the Chinese and the Iranians and the others trying to line up, and you will have, from the point of view of the West, significant actors like India going probably in the same direction. This is not a particularly good development.
I would just sort of pick up on that. We shouldn't be so drowned or blinded by Trump that we drive inevitably to the bust up, the lowest common denominator. What you just referred to in terms of the Russian action vis-a-vis Iran, anchored very firmly in the national security team, is the return of great power politics, China and Russia as real challenges. It's clear. It permeates everybody you know in the interagency. And there are very competent and good people, from Undersecretary Mattis on down, you know them all in the Pentagon, at the NSC from Mira Ricardel on down, people who know Europe, and increasingly the State Department will be getting sea legs. We've got a few more people headed in there that are very good friends of the transatlantic relationship. The common strand among the interagency team is wake up, Russia's on the march, we've been slow to get it, and China's coming. And so that is the center of gravity in Washington right now. And so my fear is that because our president has extraordinary rhetoric, because trade policy is a problem, that we drive inevitably into, you assume the worst of us, and we drive ourselves inevitably into opening the oxygen for the authoritarian kleptocrats to play the game. As much as you may or may not like the Trump administration, the perspective in their mind of preserving the West means we are the spine of that free world. And somehow we have to navigate this very difficult time politically to maintain that strategic perspective of what's unfolding and what our societies have at stake together. That's at risk.
I'd put it more simply. When I was in office, I used to have a sign on my wall and it said, "And then what?" And I would say to officials who would bring in brilliant ideas that they had to be able to answer the question, and then what? And the problem that I feel we're confronted with in part is nobody seems to be thinking about the answer to that question. I may disagree with the answer, but I'd like someone to have actually thought about it. So the signing by Iran of this agreement may have happened anyway, we don't know. But we're all thinking that it might be a consequence, certainly closer relations, driving people that you've spent years dragging towards you and got an agreement that they didn't want to do with you, and then just sending them away again, is a classic case of, well, and then what? What do you think is going to happen next? Mm-hmm. Doing things without that basic understanding that at least you know what the options are, the consequences might be, that's what worries me most, because I don't get any sense of that question being answered.
We've got 7 more minutes. Are there any more questions from the room? This is your last chance. Yes, over there, please. Yes.
Thank you. John Sabo from CEU. My question kind of, it's been touched upon energy security, and can we look at the US possibly sanctioning European companies involved in Iran as a door towards more severe, strategically important, because of course there's a lot of investment going towards Iran, Total, and whomever, but can that escalate into a Nord Stream 2 sanctioning, for instance, which would have severe repercussions on the region's strategy and relations? Thank you.
Thanks. Perhaps briefly, an escalation.
There is a full-scale campaign on Nord Stream and unity of purpose and clarity in the United States across the political spectrum in Congress. So you're seeing a lot of effort on this. It is perplexing to look at Europe and not. Again, this goes back to sort of that primal instinct of why do we feel like sometimes we care more about some of the interests on this continent than. And you know, it's not necessarily fair as an American to define those interests, but that's driving a pretty strong campaign on Nord Stream right now. I think up to, but not to the limit. There have been discussions about the consequences of extending sanctions. I think that will be talk.
In terms of, I wanted to finish on perhaps one aspect, which is if you were all of you advising European policymakers right now. You've seen the different styles. You've seen Macron, the hugging and kissing. You've seen Merkel, rather cold, more distant, warning Trump very, very early on after his election about values and principles. And you've seen another category which perhaps gets less noticed, which is I would say it's Trudeau's approach, which is you actually try to you never provoke Trump, but you try to circumvent him, working on the climate issues, for example, with governors, business, civil society. You know, the tactic of trying to circumvent him without getting into confrontation with him. What would you advise European policymakers to do in dealing with this situation? In their approach?
So any negotiation, and this is what you're doing when you meet another leader, has to begin with knowing who it is you're talking to. I spent a lot of time in negotiations doing the informal stuff, eating food, talking beforehand about other issues, never going to a meeting cold without knowing who it is you're dealing with. And finding out who this person is as relevant to President Trump as it would be to any other leader you are meeting for the first time. And that includes working out what has been a successful strategy, so taking those different strategies or tactics and looking at what works, trying to identify what motivates them and what in your relationship could motivate them. And also being clear about what it is you actually want. I'm not suggesting any of the leaders who've been there haven't tried to do that for a second. But those are the sort of things that I think become increasingly important when you can't rely on a history of them having worked in situations that are either similar or a part of the infrastructure of diplomatic or government activity. Then you can't rely on all the normal things that you would do and have to think about what is going to make a difference and look at it that way. I have no idea whether that would be successful, but it's going to have to be in the playbook.
Carl?
Well, I think the answer is fairly obvious through what I've already said. I did support President Macron's approach in the beginning. I thought it was brilliant to bring sort of President Trump to the 4th of July, and he was clearly impressed, and then to go to the White House and say that you are a stable genius or whatever Macron said, but it wasn't very far from that, and nearly promising the Nobel Prize, and not quite. But what happened that just a couple of days later was when they announced the JCPOA decision. One would have expected, which didn't come as a surprise that he was going to leave it, I would say that. But what came as a surprise to me that there was not a fraction of a millimeter take into account the concerns and the interests of Europeans, not a fraction of a millimeter. And that was really what I think, I would guess that was noticed in Paris. That means that particular approach evidently doesn't really work. The Trudeau approach, well, the jury is out on that one. The NAFTA negotiations was a really big thing for the Canadians and for the Mexicans. If I remember the figures right, I mean, the text of that agreement is 2,000 pages. They have been negotiating for a long time. They have done 1,000 of those pages. The deadline is May the 17th. They've done half of it. They have 1,000 pages left. They haven't resolved any of the major issues, including what is the most difficult among the difficult American demands is that they don't want an agreement that is long-term. They want an agreement that's only 5 years, and after 5 years it should cease to exist if it hasn't delivered the result in terms of trade effects that the Trump administration wants. I mean, there's no way whatsoever that the Canadians and the Mexicans are going to sign up to it. So whether the Trudeau approach works...
You're doubtful, yeah.
Well,
okay.
I remain to be convinced.
Okay.
I would just remind our European friends that, look, it's not like this team came in with the clarity of vision and clarity of strategy.
No.
This is a jump ball and evolutionary. So please keep showing up, keep talking to us, making phone calls, focus on where you can get stuff done, because if you actually care about your interests, you can get stuff done working with Mattis. The Balkans are ripe for US-EU cooperation right now to move the Balkans past the finish line. And then in some cases, remember that our rhetoric, our bark is going to be bigger. Some places we won't follow through, and some places we've shown that we maybe can't follow through. It's not clear to me that that's a problem for the president. His voters want to know that he emotionally is with them on some of these issues. I don't think they're going to hold him accountable on whether he actually does them. And finally, in some cases, you're going to have to show us there are consequences. We're going to have to figure out that there's consequences to our actions. And just as we saw in 2005, President Bush kiss and make up with Chirac and Schroeder. Don't close the door to how you can shape the outcome.
Thanks for that historical, almost historical now, it feels historical background. We need that experience. Before I thank the panelists and ask you to thank them with me, I want to say that there are 2 other sessions in the Maria Theresa room in half an hour on the dark web. In the Habsburg room, the subject is tech, how tech can control migration. Really? And in this room, in half an hour, we have Joseph Nye, the inventor of the expression soft power. And if there's something that we can eagerly discuss is what is left of U.S. soft power. Please join me in thanking the great panelists, Catherine, Carl, and Damon. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much.